I'll just say a quick hello to everyone. For those of you who may not know, my name is Mateusz Milan Stanojević, and I'm a professor here at the Department of English. And this is a lecture that our guest today, Professor Stephen Dickey from the University of Kansas, is going to give on aspect. And it's an introductory lecture for our cognitive science, applied cognitive science program for the course Language Structure and Conceptualization that I teach here in Zagreb. Let me just say a quick word about Stephen. So a good friend of mine and an eminent linguist from the United States. He received his PhD in Slavic Linguistics from the University of Indiana in '97, and he has published widely on a variety of Slavic languages, primarily on Slavic aspect, verbal aspect, and from a cognitive linguistic perspective. He is fluent in Croatian and Russian, and I think Czech as well.
I can read Czech.
And I don't know about the other languages. I know German, but that's about it. That's the extent of how much I know. Anyway, in addition to doing aspect, you know, for from a cognitive linguistic perspective that is theoretical, which is what we're going to hear today, he has also worked on it from a perspective that is a little bit more pedagogical. He just published a textbook on Russian aspect in conversation, which is available online, and I think you have a link to it as well. I think I'm not sure whether I put the link on or not, but anyway, it's there. And in addition to this, he is also a translator. He's translated from Croatian mostly, or I should say BCS, Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, and then Montenegrin as well, to English. His most widely known works that he has translated are Meša, Selimović, Death and the Dervish, Borislav Pekić's How to Quiet a Vampire, and Miljenko, Jergović, Ruta, Tannenbaum. Okay, that's enough from me. Stephen, thank you so much for being here, for coming. And the floor is yours, and you can start sharing and everything else, and I'll mute myself and stop my video. Or actually, I can leave the video so that you can see me if that's easier for you.
Okay, I'm going to share. Everybody see? I'll get it on slideshow. Okay, thank you so much, Matt, for your kind introduction. I really enjoy being here, if virtually. Matt said that I am fluent in Croatian, and I guess I think I am, but I have a little personal foible, and it's when I talk about nauka, I like to do it in my native language. I don't know why. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to give this talk in English, but with mostly Croatian data. And you know, this is designed to be an introductory talk. Unfortunately, there's so much that I have to leave out, but hopefully it will still do you some good and be interesting. So let's get started. We could maybe ask ourselves a question: what makes Slavic Slavic in terms of language? Now there are a whole host of answers to this question. If we talk about grammar, we could say that it has a rich case system, okay, except for in Bulgarian and Macedonian. That is definitely true. It also has very rich voice systems, active, passive, and middle. By middle, I'm thinking of all of the functions of se grouped together. But then really, I think the most important thing is that they have nearly unique verbal aspect systems, these languages. One thing that is unique about them is that they're all based on prefixation and suffixation, which is different than most aspect systems. Even the Greek system, which is in terms of usage maybe closest to Slavic in Indo-European. And then in terms of the semantics, there are significant referential and discourse functions of aspect in all of these languages. And so this is why I think, or one of the reasons why I think verbal aspect is worth knowing about. I think you might just say also, or one can say, it has been claimed for Russian that it's really the central grammatical category of these languages. Okay, I think maybe there's not quite so much at stake in Croatian, but I think it still is there's a kernel of truth in that. So one thing that's important to know is that Slavic verbal aspect is more than just past time. Like we have, past tense differences in French and so on. But with the exception of the bottom three categories I have here, you have imperfective and perfective verb forms for each form. So infinitives, present tense, past tense, future tense, imperative, subjunctive, passive participles, and so on. And this means one thing that we can infer from this, which I think is important to point out, that the opposition, the semantic nature of the opposition must be very basic, and it is pretense. Okay, you don't need to have a verb inflected for tense to then have aspect be relevant. Well, what is this aspect anyway? I'll give you a few definitions here. Let me get there we go. Probably the most famous definition is given by Comrie, 1976, textbook on aspect. Aspects are different ways of viewing the internal temporal constituency of a situation. I prefer one that a colleague of mine and I have come up with recently, which is aspect as a grammatical category that expresses the epistemic stance of the speaker to the existence of a situation in time, often in relation to the knowledge sets of other discourse participants. And a corollary of that definition, or maybe both of them, is that aspects are ultimately referential categories. That is, they refer in different ways to the existence of a situation in time. And these different referential strategies boil down to different construals of an action in time, and that is what we will be talking a lot about in the next few minutes. One thing that I had wanted to point out at the beginning that I forgot was that students of your age may be unaware, but it was in fact the study of Slavic aspect that created the entire field of aspect studies or aspectology in general linguistics in the early 20th century. Now, the study of Slavic aspect, or Slavic as representative of an aspect system, has been eclipsed by endless emphasis on English and some other Western European languages, but it was Slavic that really got the ball rolling. Oops, let's see here. Okay. Now, before we get into the construals, one thing I would like to point out, I don't know whether you're aware of it, is that there are some remarkable parallels between nouns and verbs that form maybe the basis for some of the referential functions of each. So if the things denoted by nouns exist in space and events or actions exist in time, we've got those two domains, but then we've got whether something is bounded in its domain or not. So voda is unbounded in the domain of space. Any boundedness of water is entirely artificial based on the laws of physics. I won't go into those. Whereas a kanta is inherently bounded in space. You can't think of a bucket without those prototypical outlines that it has, where it begins and ends, if you will. Same thing goes on with events and time. Something like siediti is unbounded in principle. It can continue or stop can continue for quite some time. There's nothing to prevent it in principle from continuing. Whereas something like skočiti, okay, has these bounds like the bucket. So you can see on the left the beginning of the jump, and then we have on the right the end of the jump, and that's how jumps are. They're inherently bounded. One related phenomena is that, whoops. Any subpart of water is also water, okay? Not true. Well, let's go down to siediti. Any subpart, any subphase of sitting can also be described as siediti. There's no problem with doing that. But it's not true with things that are bounded in their domain. A subpart of a bucket, like the lower right-hand corner that we see here, cannot also be described as bucket. Okay. Likewise, one phase of a jump cannot be referred to as the jump. I'm sorry, I forgot to turn my email off. It keeps beeping. These parallels will ultimately allow us to see some parallels between nouns and verbs. Maybe I can say just a little bit about those later, but the bounding is very important for understanding the perfective and the imperfective in Slavic languages. I think you all have already had a discussion of situation type. I'll just go through this very quickly. We have 5 situation types: states, activities, accomplishments, achievements, and semifactives. Some of them are atelic, those are states and activities. Maybe you can think of semifactives this way. States in Croatian are never perfectivized, really, okay? And that's what these little zeros after the slash signify. Activities are not regularly perfectivized in Croatian, although we can see that placati and plakati can get a quasi perfective partners, a placati is a plakati, to do it for a little bit, but it's not reliable. So we can't really just say that hands down we have the opposition with activities either. The 2 types that are really the core of the aspect opposition are these accomplishments and achievements. That's where we find the most reliable pairs, and I won't read all these pairs off, but you can see them. So accomplishments have a process that precedes the endpoint, whereas achievements are momentary. Semifactives are also momentary, but don't really produce a result like achievements. They just, everything returns to the way it was, basically. I'm simplifying a little bit here, but that's that we can say that for all intents and purposes. And semifactives are always perfective, really. Something like gurati refers to repeated pushes, and it's kind of reanalyzed as an activity, like a cyclical activity. Okay, so Croatian is very. I mean, what I've showed you here, and to wit, with Croatian data, this is the way this works for Croatian. Other Slavic languages with say, if we talk about Russian, behave a little differently in this regard, but I will not detour into that now. So let's talk about the construals of the perfective and the imperfective. The core of the perfective aspect in Croatian is prefixation, and the vast majority of perfective verbs are prefixed. Like, to build, okay, combines 2 things. There's a conjunction here. There's the notion of sa, which is like together, everything ending up at the same place. And then there's, of course, graditi, the building process. You probably don't think about it, but it's very interesting that the prefix comes first. Okay, it is in fact the point of reference for this entire verb and the point of reference for accessing gradity. So that if we have a conceptualizer who thinks, speaks, or reads sagradity, the first thing that is processed is the result configuration, and then only do we reach the target of what kind of coming together it is afterwards. We access the target gradity via the reference point sa. I'll just say very quickly one thing that is unique about Slavic is the univerbation. Okay, there's nothing that ever occurs between the prefix and the source verb, and this is ultimately related to why they profile this result. Okay. You could even think of sagradity. We usually think of sagradity as a type of gradity. Another way of thinking of it is a kind of sa. Okay, and we can replace all kinds, saživjetise or things like this. We can switch out the source verb. So prefix perfectives are reference point constructions. Prefixation is ultimately a verb classifier system with perfectivization as a byproduct. That is, all Slavic verbs, Croatian verbs, are basically classified according to their outcomes. What kind of event it is classified according to the outcome. And moreover, that spatial configuration profiled by the prefix is the cognitive access point for the event conceptualization. The result of this is that prefix perfectives and perfectives in general always assert the outcome or the result of the event that cannot be canceled. Okay, a good way to think about it is that prefix perfectives always profile an event conjoined with its subsequently ensuing result. Okay, so the event is S1 and the result is S2. Okay, and those things are always packaged together. Now let's go, let's talk about this morphology just a little bit more. Formal linguists love to make equivalencies between Slavic perfective verbs and English simple forms like the simple past. So if you have the sentence Sagradio je kuću za samo 3000 eura, the translation of this is he built a house for only 3,000 euros. And it looks like built is just an analog, an equivalent of sagradity. But English build, it's more complicated. It can contextually refer to a completed event, and maybe even that's a default with an object in a simple tense. But this is easily canceled. So, you can find online, we knew we'd need a barn to keep all our belongings and tools in while we built. That's impossible in Croatian. You cannot say znali smo da nam treba ambar da bismo u njoj čuvali sve naše stvari, ale dok sagradimo. That does not work. Or likewise, as we built the house, we started noticing cracks in the foundation. Likewise, sagradili here is impossible. So we need to take the morphology seriously. Sa is that access point that results in the assertion of the result. There's no comparable access point in English build. Okay. All right, moving on, let's talk about the referential range of perfective verbs. The assertion of an outcome makes the perfective obligatory in cases when the outcome of a single past action is in effect at the moment of speech. Okay, and we might add is relevant for the continued discourse. So, a good Croatian example is došla sam da se s tobom oprostim. Okay. This is, again, not just a matter of the past tense. Future works just as, or in an analogous fashion. If you say, doći ću da se s tobom oprostim, when we speak about the future, we idealize what's going to happen. And if we intend to do something, we idealize, the idealistic construal is that it will have its outcome. So when we tell somebody, oh, I'll come to say goodbye to you, we don't worry about all those contingencies like getting run over by a car on the way to somebody's house or something like this. We idealistically assume that, yes, we will make it there and be able to say goodbye. Another maybe related, but in terms of genre or discourse, different function is the assertion of an outcome or result enables subsequent action. So the perfective occurs regularly to refer to single events in a sequence. And you can find anytime you read a story, you read gobs of this. Došao sam do nje, umirio joj disanje, osvježio usne I gladio je po glavi. We'll talk about gladio a little bit later. Okay. However, it does get a little more complicated. In Croatian, perfective verbs are also frequently refer to repeated events as long as the result is asserted for each repetition. The way that a result will be relevant is if we have some kind of quantified object. Okay, I've got a couple of examples of this. So sad popuši 2-3 cigarete na dan, or prema statistici Argentinac godišnje pojede I do 70 kilograma. Okay. And when I was starting out and doing my research, I didn't realize how widespread this is in Croatian. I think there's a tendency to follow the Russian pattern among linguists, and it took a long time before Croatian linguists, really started emancipating their descriptions of what the perfective does from the Russian facts. And so one of these was an article by Jelena Šarić in 2000, shows that you can also do this in the past tense. Okay, so the person repeatedly turned around, but we nevertheless get the perfective. Okay, and it's the same thing on each individual repetition. It produced its result. That is, that he could see the person. Okay. Now, I think it's time to go to imperfectives. Let's talk about the referential range first before we get to the construal. The construal is more complicated. So what do imperfective verbs do? Well, the big fact about imperfective verbs is that they never assert the outcome, that S2, as a state of affairs that is relevant for the continued discourse. Okay, which leaves them with three main functions. The first one is to refer to ongoing processes or open-ended situations. Dok smo gradili kuću. Okay, this is the example from earlier. Or even in narratives, when something is conceptualized as just not necessarily coming to an end, or we're left not knowing what happened, at least in that sentence. So, osvježio usne I gladio je po glavi. All right. Referential function number 2, to refer to an open-ended repetition of processes, to refer to open-ended repetitions of processes or completed events. And it doesn't matter, as I pointed out, whether it's completed or not. So ponekad smo pili kuhano vino, that is just a process, whereas zapisivali su od starih žena stihove, narodne običaje, and so on. That's repetition of completed events. And then last, but maybe not least, is the function to refer to single complete events in isolation from a context. And these are called statements or questions of fact. I'll just refer to them as statements of fact. So an example would be, jesi li ikada gledao ovaj film? We're interested whether it happened sometime in the past. We have no idea when that would have been, what the occasion was like. This is what I'm trying to model with this graphic here. I don't know how successful it is. I would also point out here that unlike some other Slavic languages, such as Russian, this function is not the sole domain of the imperfective. So it's easy for Croatians to ask jesi li saznao što to znači? Not saznavao, jesi li saznao što to znači? All right, so these are the main three functions. Referential functions. So what do we do with the construal? Well, in the interests of time, I'm going to keep this simple and give you what I think would, among cognitive linguists, be the main way of dealing with this. We would say that there is a schema, okay, which is some kind of open-endedness, unboundedness. And I've tried to model this by kind of bleaching out the arrow in the S2. That's not really part of the schema. It's just designed to show you what's missing there. And then this has three instantiations, okay? The prototypical instantiation is the process meaning, which has the thick boundary around that node. And then we also have open-ended repetition, and then this statement of fact function, which is probably the most marginal. And then each of repetition and the statement of fact are going to be extensions from the prototype of process. And I think if we were going to do it justice, we would need to say that the statement of fact is probably in some way an extension of the repetition function. Okay. All right. So what I would like to go on to now is very quickly discourse effects of the aspects. We talked about all this completion and bounding and so on. In every Slavic language, there are these notorious cases in which the imperfective occurs where one would expect, if you will, the perfective. Okay. First type, this is something that's well known, occurs in imperatives. So you can tell somebody vracaj to, depending on who you're talking to. And that more or less equals vratito. That is, they both refer to a single instance of taking something back. I'll just say very quickly that I loathe the formulation that, say an imperfective like vracaj is equivalent to vrati. It's only partially equivalent to it. A lot of people love to truck in this equivalency. I think it's wrong. They're not synonymous. They have different effects in discourse. Another one is the use of the imperfective past in statements of fact. Okay, so nisam upućen u financije, čitao sam da savez neće dobiti potreban novac, and so on, and that more or less equals, pročitao sam. Okay, so I read it once, basically. Imperatives involve relationships between discourse participants and authority and hierarchies. I will not discuss the imperative now. Maybe I could do that in question and answers. I will talk about this latter one. I've done a little bit of preliminary work on this. Here's 4 representative examples of this, of both the perfective and the imperfective in statements of fact like this, taken from the Klasla corpus. I won't read these, but we've got 2 examples with the perfective, and they don't really look that different from the 3 and 4, the examples in the imperfective. One thing that I have done recently is I just collected a preliminary set of data from the corpus, rather small, but came up with some possible predictor variables, that are about discourse, have nothing to do with completion, processuality, repetition, and so on. And scrutinized them, showed them to a native speaker. We had some detailed discussions about them. And the outcome was this, largely based on the native speaker's intuitions, that the perfective signals that the speaker remembers where they read the information. Okay. And like a side effect of this is that the information tends to be interesting or important to them. This is kind of an understandable correlation. If an idea is important to you, you probably remember where you were first exposed to it. Okay. In contrast, the imperfective signals that the speaker does not remember exactly where they read the information. And the information, not always, but it tends to be something that's not a primary concern, that they have other ultimate concerns, and this is just something mentioned incidentally along the way. I'm not saying that this is the sole thing that would produce such a variation, but I think it's an important one. The native speaker characterize the imperfective as like I read somewhere, or negdje sam čitao, or something like this, or even I remember reading, which ironically you only say when you really don't remember that much about it. You just remember that you did read it. So this is the most under-researched part of Slavic aspect, and it is definitely the most under-researched part of Croatian aspect and aspect in other languages such as Czech. But to my mind, it's the most fascinating part of it. And if we're going to fully describe these categories, you have to get at this stuff, and it's not easy to do. Okay, so we'll move on now. Interesting thing, Slavic aspect is not monolithic. So I've got some of our Croatian examples with Russian equivalents, and we see, for instance, 1A with the repetition, Russians cannot use perfective present there. They have to use the imperfective. Use of the perfective for repeated events in Russian is very limited. Okay. If you're trying to make somebody feel good and invite them in, you say ujite in Croatian with the perfective. If you're really trying to make somebody feel good, you don't use the perfective vaidite. It's possible, but it gives a different vibe, and might not be used with pожалуйста that much. It's vaidite, the imperfective. Okay. Likewise, imperfective verbs cannot be used in sequences of events. Okay, so we have our example with gladio here in Croatian. There's two possibilities for Russian. They either use a phase verb started to pat, or they say pogledil, patted for a while, but they can't just simply, shove gladil in there like a Croat can. And then last but not least, for sure, where we have pročitao sam da Židovi vjeruju da život počinje svako jutro. Russians cannot do that there. It's conceivable that they could use the perfective, but it would have a very strange effect. If you said я читал, я прочитал, что евреи верят, что жизнь начинается каждое утро, that would mean that you, for some reason, know that the listener wanted to know that fact. You went to the trouble of reading about it and now are ready to tell them about it. If you just want to tell what your source of your information was, whether you remember it or not, you use читал in Russian. And this brings us then, this is just a smattering of a lot of vastly different data in languages like Croatian and Russian, or even Croatian and Czech. And this brings us to it brings us to what the Russian perfective means, and it's a lot more complicated than just S1 or S2. And my term for this is temporal definiteness. The Russian perfective, beyond signaling the completion of the event, that's P there in the middle, says that it's in sequence with other events or situations. So one of the things that I think is superior about cognitive linguistics is that it can say, okay, well, the construal expressed by the Russian perfective is different than the construal expressed by the Croatian perfective, and we're not forced to make arbitrary rules like, oh, well, the one form in one language has an implicature that is somehow lacking in the other language. That's what formal linguists do, and I think it really leads nowhere. Also brings us to the typology of Slavic aspect. This is something that I've probably spent, I guess, most of my career investigating. People talk about Slavic aspect all the time, but there are really different subsystems. So we have what I would call an Eastern Slavic subsystem that consists of East Slavic, Bulgarian, and then Macedonian a little bit. We have a Western system, which is Czech, Slovak, Serbian, and Slovene. Then we have a transitional zone in the north, Polish, which, as time goes on, I've learned patterns more closely to the Western pattern than I originally thought, but it still has some important affinities with the Eastern pattern. And then Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, and then we can tack Macedonian on this, or we'll stick Montenegro in there. This is an old slide. Montenegrin. Are also a transitional zone, and even though I've got them listed alphabetically, it's the transitionality really is west to east. Croatian is closest to the Western type. Bosnian is maybe somewhere in between, and Serbian tends to be a little closer to the Eastern type. Okay. What I have spent the last 20 years doing, and it's still unfinished, is trying to figure out how this division arose, and it is extraordinarily complicated. I will not go into that, but I would like to make just a couple of brief diachronic comments, and we could talk about how the perfective aspect arose in Slavic. And so what I've got here is a network diagram of the prefixes or the perfectivizing prefixes in Common Slavic. And we've got a group of source prefixes, that's the ones with the red links. Got a group of gold prefixes, those are the ones with the lavender links. And then we've got the green links, which are path, location, okay? Early on, before the category was established, these prefixes had no perfectivizing function. They just express these spatial configurations. That is, if you go back, I don't know, 3,000 years or something, sagraditi, to the extent that they had that particular verb back then, was not perfective. It was just like something like English put together. You can say I put it together or I was putting it together. They were not restricted to refer to complete events. There was what we call a catastrophe in a network like this, which was where one thing happened that the consequences of that event were far more significant than the initial event. What happened was that U, one of the source prefixes, which originally meant away, something like away, almost like ought, okay? And I think somehow I left ought off of this. Well, it doesn't matter. U was spatially bleached. It stopped meaning away and it started meaning result. When that happened, it changed the links between all the members of the network and in fact gave them a new superseding link. And these are the ones that are in light blue. Oh no, so we have ought here. I'm looking in the wrong part, sorry. Some of the blue links are not quite so visible. That's just part of the graph. But the thing that all of these prefixes started sharing, and they had all had tendencies to start to express completed events, but this kind of locked it into the system. That the thing that all of these prefixes share now is this result meaning, and that was how the perfective aspect arose. And it's all tied in with the univerbation of prefix and source verb, which I mentioned earlier. The last thing I would like to mention in connection with diachronic phenomena is that aspect arose in Common Slavic, and that I don't know exactly when we don't know exactly when it arose, but let's say 2,000 years ago, okay, or at least 1,500 years ago. We don't know when. It has not degraded in any Slavic language. It is remarkably stable. Why is that? Slavic languages have lost all kinds of grammatical categories. They've lost aorists and imperfects and other things. Or English, the demonstrative pronoun se in English became the definite article the. There's lots of change that goes on. I'm not saying that aspect does not change in these languages, but it never disappears. The only language in which aspect has been degraded to the degree that it doesn't really obligatorily, or the perfective aspect has been degraded such that it doesn't obligatorily refer to completed events, is Upper Sorbian. But that is a situation of complete and total language contact with German, which is a non-aspect language. So we can forget about that. But the other languages, it doesn't disappear. Okay. Well, why would that be? I'm going to give this, here we've got a network of Croatian perfectivizing prefixes. This is basically the same thing. All of the links, the blue link that all of them share, and I imagine I left out some links here, but it gets really complicated to do this. Is that they perfectivize verbs. Okay, that's what they all share. Well, if you've got a possessive construction like I have a rabbit, killed or something, and something happens with that one marker have, then it can easily change its nature. So, we get a perfect, I have killed a rabbit. Or you have a single marker in English, which is a demonstrative se, and something weird happens, some semantic, change happens, and then there's nothing to keep it from becoming a definite article. Or the aorist, in Slavic, most Slavic languages have lost it. Certainly urban speakers don't use it outside of Balkan Slavic. You only have one marker, that conjugation, and there's nothing to keep it stable if there's some semantic disruption with that marker. Well, we've got, how many markers do we have here? We've got like 7, 12, 7, 16, 18, Not all of these are necessarily completely productive now, but they all occur on verbs that people use all the time. Well, let's say for the sake of argument that uz is, becomes no longer productive in Croatian, okay? And I think that's true. I don't think it really prefixes loan verbs or anything like this. Well, if the perfectivizing function of uz is degraded, doesn't really matter. We've got all these other prefixes. The network is a little bit attenuated, but the structure remains, and the grammatical category remains in place. And I would argue that it is, in fact, this small world network aspect of perfectivizing prefixation is the reason why people still use these old uz verbs or uz construction, like some people say uz treba and things like this. Because if uz is not terribly, high frequency, or it's become marginalized, it's still bolstered by every other member of the network. And so we'll have people still using those verbs as perfectives. I would love to talk about other diachronic developments, but I think I am right out of time. And so I will end it there. I am happy to answer questions. Hvala na pažnji.